The morning sun filtered through the wide windows of Miller's diner, casting soft golden light across the worn vinyl booths and laminate tables. It was the kind of light that made everything look gentler, kinder somehow. Grace Williams moved between the tables with practiced efficiency. Her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her uniform crisp despite the early hour. At 23, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her circumstances. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She wiped down each table as though it were the only task in the world that mattered. The breakfast rush had ended, leaving behind the usual debris of crumpled napkins, sticky syrup rings, and forgotten coffee cups. Grace didn't mind. There was something meditative about the work, something that allowed her thoughts to wander to better times, while her hands stayed busy. She approached table 7, the corner booth by the window. A father and son sat there, and she'd noticed them before. The man, perhaps in his late 30s, had kind eyes and an easy smile. His son, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wore a bright red sweater and had that boundless energy that only children possess. "Daddy, look, it's her again," the boy said, his voice carrying that particular clarity children have before they learn to whisper. Grace felt her cheeks warm. She kept her eyes on the table, gathering the empty plates with practiced movements. The boy's father, whose name she'd later learn was David, gently shushed his son, but there was no harshness in it. "It's all right," Grace said softly, offering a small smile. "Can I get you gentlemen anything else?" "No, thank you," David replied, his voice warm. "Everything was wonderful as always." As Grace turned to leave, the boy spoke again. "Why don't you ever talk to anyone?" "Tommy," David said, a note of apology in his voice as he looked at Grace. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," Grace interrupted gently. She looked at the boy, really looked at him. His eyes held simple curiosity, nothing cruel. "I guess I'm just quiet by nature." Tommy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. "My grandma says quiet people hear more." "Is that true?" Grace felt something shift in her chest, a small crack in the wall she'd built so carefully. "Your grandma sounds very wise." Over the following weeks, this became their ritual. David and Tommy would come in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, always sitting at table 7. Tommy would wave when Grace approached, and she found herself looking forward to these small interactions, these brief moments of connection. One Thursday morning, Grace arrived at the diner to find it busier than usual. A large family occupied several tables, their children running between booths while the adults tried to maintain order. Grace moved through the chaos with her usual calm, but she noticed David and Tommy sitting patiently at their usual spot, having already ordered. As she cleared a nearby table, she overheard an older woman at the counter speaking to Maggie, the owner. "I don't know why you keep that girl," the woman said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She never smiles, never makes conversation. It's bad for business." Grace's hands stilled on the plates she was holding. She'd heard variations of this before, but it never stopped hurting. "Mrs. Patterson," Maggie said firmly, "Grace is one of the finest employees I've ever had. She shows up early, works hard, and treats every task with respect. That's worth more than forced cheerfulness." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to cry at work. "Daddy," Tommy's voice rang out clear across the diner. "That lady is being mean." The restaurant fell quiet. David placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, but Tommy continued, his child's voice filled with simple conviction. "Grace is nice. She remembered that I like my pancakes with the syrup on the side. And she always makes sure the table is really clean so my sleeves don't get sticky. That's being a good person." Grace stood frozen, her heart hammering. She didn't know where to look, what to do. David stood then, his hand still on Tommy's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice was measured but clear enough for everyone to hear. "My son's right. Since we started coming here 6 weeks ago, Grace has been nothing but kind and professional. She doesn't need to be chatty to be good at her job. In fact, in a world where everyone talks too much and listens too little, I find her thoughtfulness refreshing." Mrs. Patterson huffed and turned back to her coffee, but several other patrons nodded in agreement. One older man even said, "Here, here." Grace felt the tears coming now, unstoppable. She quickly turned and walked toward the back, seeking refuge in the kitchen. Maggie found her there a few minutes later, wiping her eyes with her apron. "You okay, honey?" I didn't expect... Grace couldn't finish the sentence. People to stand up for you? Maggie said gently. Maybe it's time you expected a little more kindness from the world. Grace, and maybe time to give yourself a little more credit, too. When Grace returned to the floor, she found an envelope at table 7 with her name on it. Inside was a note in neat handwriting. Grace, please forgive Tommy's forwardness and mine as well. But sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and your quiet kindness has meant more than you know. My wife passed away 2 years ago, and Tommy and I have been finding our way. These Tuesday and Thursday mornings, with your gentle presence and patient service, have become anchor points in our week. You've taught my son that kindness doesn't have to be loud. Thank you, David. Grace had to read it 3 times before the words truly sank in. She'd spent so long thinking she wasn't enough, not friendly enough, not outgoing enough, not whatever enough, that she'd forgotten. She could simply be herself, and that would be enough, too. The next Tuesday, when David and Tommy arrived, Grace did something she rarely did. She smiled broadly as they approached. Good morning, Tommy. Good morning, David. Tommy beamed. Good morning, Grace. Guess what? Dad said you're teaching me something important. Oh? Grace asked, genuinely curious. David met her eyes with understanding. That the quietest person in the room often has the strongest character. That kindness isn't about volume, it's about consistency. Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. Thank you, she whispered. Both of you. As she wiped down their table after they'd finished, slowly, carefully, with the same attention she always gave, Grace realized something profound. She'd spent years thinking she needed to be different, louder, more outgoing. But maybe the world needed quiet people too. People who wiped tables with care. People who remembered how a little boy liked his syrup. People who showed up every day and did their work with dignity and grace. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had always been enough. Daddy, look, it's her again. Tommy would continue to say each Tuesday and Thursday. But now, instead of making Grace want to disappear, those words made her stand a little straighter. Because she understood now what the boy was really saying. He was saying, there she is, the kind lady. There she is, our friend. There she is. Exactly as she should be. And that, Grace learned, was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said about her.